Hi, my name is Jim Knight, and welcome to Coaching Conversations today. I have my longtime colleague and friend, Peter DeWitt. We've known each other, I bet you we've known each other a decade now, Peter. It's been,
Right, yeah, probably. Well, I've known you for a decade. I think you've known me for a little while less.
if you're watching this, I'm sure you know Peter, but I'll say a few things about Peter's work. He's prolific. He just puts out a book he's like fighting it out with Michael Fullen to see who can publish more books faster. It's kind of the way it's going. And Coach It Further is a book that he released not too long ago. School Climate, his book on school climate, Flipping Leadership, Dignity for All. And I really resonate with the concept of dignity and John Crownapple's work on that too. And then most recently, Collaborative Leadership and then Instructional Leadership. So we're going to sort of take a tour of all those things, but I want to say Peter and I have worked together on a number of different things. He was gracious enough before he got so big we can't get his attention. Gracious enough to help share some of our ideas around coaching. And I've appreciated your part in my life as a thought partner, but also appreciated your friendship. So I'm grateful for you making the time. If you haven't seen it, Peter and I had a conversation yesterday where he interviewed me. So I said, well, let's just interview each other. So you could look for that if you want to hear the other side of the story. And hopefully there's a few people here who heard me yesterday and wanted to hear Peter's side of the story. So that's it. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time. I loved our conversation yesterday. I don't think we'll meet that standard, but I'm grateful for the chance to talk with you.
Well, we're not going to meet that standard because you're probably a much more interesting interview than I am. So no, thanks, Jim. I appreciate you having me. This is, we get to see each other twice in 2 days. So that's pretty awesome.
I know. We still haven't met in an airport, which is kind of amazing. I think it should happen sometime, but well, not these days, but sometime in the future. So I want to sort of take kind of a tour of your work and really emphasize two books that I think are really important in understanding your contribution. But one would be Collaborative Leadership, and then the newest book, Instructional Leadership. But I have these kind of warm-up questions. You get one of the questions I've never asked before. So I'm testing it out on you. We'll see if it works or not.
Great.
But the first question is, what's something that people don't know about you?
Yeah, that's a hard one because I've been writing for Ed Week for 9 years. I've written 1,000 blogs, so I feel like I'm a chronic oversharer. But I think the thing that probably surprises people that many people don't know is that I was very much an unsuccessful learner. So I was retained in 4th grade. My dad died when I was in 5th. My mom went back to get her GED when I was in 6th grade. She never remarried. And then I graduated 4th from last in my high school class. I was 262 out of 266 from Queensbury High School in upstate New York. And then I bounced around to 3 community colleges. And on the 3rd one, I had a coach because I was a long distance runner that just said, DeWitt, you're not going to be a professional runner. I think you need to go into the Learning Assistance Center. And I went in with a 1.7 GPA that semester, and I walked out with a 3.86. And life changed drastically for me after that because I ended up, I'm the youngest of 5, but the first to go to college. And I think, though, many people might know that story if they've seen me present or if they've read one of the books. But one of the things that came along with that I thought I don't know if I've ever told anybody before, is that it created deep insecurities for me for a very long time. I was actually somebody that sort of walked into teaching. I loved teaching. I loved being an elementary school teacher. And I walked in with sort of a chip on my shoulder, like nobody could understand what it was like to have the life that I had. And because I kind of grew up in West Glens Falls, which was not known as the wealthier section of where I was growing up and all that stuff. And then I met kids that came from drastically different situations than I did. And I think I grew up and through teaching. But that insecurity really stayed with me for a long time. And then when I became a principal, I was 35. And now I graduated from college, my bachelor's degree when I was 24. It was like 3 months before I was 25. So for years, I'd always heard from both school, because I was retained in fourth grade, that I was older than everybody. I mean, I still get that. I'm turning 50 in a few weeks.
Oh, you're a kid.
And when people say, what year did you graduate from high school? And they say 89, they're like, wait a second, I graduated in 89 and I'm 2 years younger than you. And I'm like, well, that's because I was retained. And so when I was 35 and I became a principal, I started to hear weird things, which was, wow, you're young to be a principal. I was thinking, how did that happen? But I remember doing I used to do a lot of work for our NBC affiliate here in Albany, New York. And Elaine Houston, who's one of the anchors, she still is, I had made the mistake of drinking 2 glasses of wine the night before I was going to be on the news. And I was like, thank you so much for taking time, and I mentioned that I was 262 out of 266, and she used it in the news interview the next day. And I thought I was going to pass out. And honestly, and she said, this is a very good story that you need to be able to share. And I would say that was when the insecurity started to go away, but I still, I think people think because like we present and we write and all that stuff, that we must be these completely confident people all the time. And it's actually not true. I go through times where I'm like deeply insecure, and then other times where I feel very confident. I'm like, okay, let's go. And it's probably one of the reasons why I meditate every day too. See, I'm a chronic oversharer. I told you.
No, you're not. I'm already very grateful for this conversation. I'll overshare you. Not that it's a competition, but I ask this question in my, I have a thing called the Examine, the Ignatian school of thought talks about the Examine as a spiritual discipline. And at the end of the day, you ask yourself a bunch of questions. And one of my questions is, when was God close to you? And another question is, when was God far away? And almost every time God is far away, it's related to professional work. And often it has to do with sort of forgetting the purpose. For me, if I can remind myself the purpose of this work is to do the best I can for kids in whatever way I can, then I don't go into that kind of dark space. But if I forget about that, then I can waste a lot of useless energy on, who's stealing my ideas, or who's all that kind of stuff. And I don't think you overshare. I think it's really great that you share that, because I think it's a power. And I'll just say this too, is that after 2 years of university, I got kicked out. I was a D- average. I mean, I was 1 above F, so I'm with you on the low. The only thing the reason I graduated from high school is, first off, back when I went there, everybody graduated. You show up, you graduate. And they just wanted to get rid of me. So that's how that went, I think. We had to go to grade 13 in Canada.
Really?
Yeah, we had and I don't know when they stopped doing that. In Ontario, at any rate, it was grade 13. But so I had an extra year.
I found out I was graduating from high school 2 weeks before graduation, because Mr. Stark, my drama teacher, I remember I was failing drama, which is kind of ironic now, but I remember my coach, Pat Sweeney, at the time. I still talk to my coaches to this day. And Sweeney looked at me and said, how can you fail drama? Act! And I was like, I'm trying. And I swear Mr. Stark just passed me with what I needed to pass, because, it was time to move on. And the funny thing is, my sister, who is actually my sister Trish, who I'm very close with, who is very responsible for me. She was like National Honor Society, and but my dad died 3 months before she graduated from high school, and she ended up dropping out of college to take care of me. So when I got to the 3rd community college, she was like, I just want you to go and get more than we have. And she ended up going back and getting her degree. She works at Skidmore College. Her 3 sons went through. But I remember just like feeling like when I was at the 1st community college, she was working there at the time, and she had me do this, like one of those interest tests, like, what do you want in the future? And I swear to you, when I took the test as a student, that I was working at a liquor store, I was not passing, probably because I wasn't going to class. there's a little bit of correlation there, but I remember taking this test and it actually said that that I wanted to be a writer and a teacher. And I remember looking at that test going, this is crap. This is like so wrong. And it's really funny to think back, like how did that happen? Like, did it inspire me to go on the path that I did, or did I just really, was it in there? So it's always very interesting for me to look back on all that.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I think Failing Drama is a great title for a book. I think that's like Brene Brown type.
Is that it? My next.
Well, you can have that title. I'm giving it to you. Failing Drama. Write it down. Don't forget.
I'll start writing.
So aside for that title for the book, here's my second question. What's something you're really grateful for right now? What are you grateful for?
Time, home, just some things that are going on in my family with some health issues. It is COVID has sort of, we've talked about this in the past. I was on the road so much, and you get caught up in a lot of stuff when you're like, your work is taken off and you're presenting and all that stuff, and you make promises to be home, and then you find it getting further and further away. And there could never be a better time for me to be home, just because of some things that are going on with like my mom and my sister, and my brother-in-law's from Beirut, and with the bombing or with the explosions that happened yesterday. And so I feel like I'm grateful to have this time at home, and I truly think it's going to change. It's already changing my behavior, but I think it's going to change my behavior in a way that I'm not going to go back out on the road like I used to. And so that's what I would say I'm thankful for, is just I'm grateful for having time every day.
So I'd like to move on to the work. Actually, I wouldn't like to. I'd like to just stay here, but I have my sort of agenda, and I'm going to follow my agenda. So what are just a little bit more background, what experiences led you to live out your little test you had from your sister on your aptitude for life? How did you end up being an author or teacher, principal, consultant?
Yeah, like I've always, much to your grateful question, I've always been grateful for everything that I have. And I think I'm lucky because my mom is always my like biggest fan. And when I was a teacher, she introduced me like, this is Pete. He's my baby, which we always get called when we're the youngest, and no matter how old you are. And, she would say he's a teacher. And then when I became a principal, he's a principal. Just one led to another. I don't think I had a grand scheme. Like, I was a teacher for 11 years in some high poverty city schools. I loved being a teacher. I learned a lot from the kids. I was in diverse situations. It was about expanding everything I was doing, but I found that it almost felt like, after being unsuccessful for so many years, that something opened up in me, and I felt like this constant, sometimes exhausting need to learn. So through working with students, and then I had no intention of being a principal. I actually remember I was doing my master's degree in ed psych at Marist College, and my principal at the time said, I think you should be doing a degree in school administration. I was like, I'm never going to be a principal. I actually said that to him. And then I had a couple of guys that were retired teachers that said, that I used to see at All Sport, which was a gym in Poughkeepsie, New York, who said, well, what if you could be the principal you want to be, not the one you think you have to be? And like, those words never left me. So about 3 years later, when I moved up to Albany, I went back to get my degree in school administration. And I started as an adjunct professor at the same college. And it became this really great learning experience where I was taking these great classes that I was learning from. I was teaching during the day. But after I took the class, I was teaching because I'm the new adjunct. You're teaching the late shift. So, 7:30 to 10. But it was amazing. Like, I felt like I was so lucky to have all of it. And then after becoming a principal, which I loved, I was there for 7.5 years. And then I took a 6-month leave of absence. And you're partly the reason that happened. So my teachers that were upset that I left, it's actually your fault, but we won't go there yet. But yeah, I think when I was a principal, I was doing my doctoral work, and I remember writing reflections. So I'm doing my doctoral work and I'm a principal, and then I was doing these reflections for class, and I ended up sending them into a New York State publication called School Administrators Association of New York State. And they actually told me that they never published the same person two issues in a row. And I ended up getting published 4 in a row. And then they hired me. And I was like, oh my God, you can make money writing an article. And that's where my educational writing career started. And then after that, I started writing for Ed Week. And then, my doctoral work actually turned out to be my first book with Corwin. So it sort of just like started to spiral that way. And it was a very difficult decision to leave the principalship. But I had to explore what was being offered to me. I almost felt like I don't like living with regrets.
Mm.
And I felt like I would regret not taking the opportunities that were coming to me.
Right. Well, and your blog went on to be, and continues to be, incredibly popular. I don't know what your followers are now, but probably over 100,000. I mean, it's maybe the most popular blog in education.
Oh no, I don't think that. There are other blogs that I think are much better than mine.
Well, it's loved. And I was honored just to be mentioned periodically in it before I met you. That, wow, Peter DeWitt said something about the partnership principles. So I'm stealing one of your questions, and maybe you feel you've already answered this question, but is there a single learning experience you had that you would say had a big impact on your writing? This one event that kind of made a difference.
Yeah, I would say when I got hired to write for Ed Week, it was a profound experience for me because I had this professor who ended up becoming my doctoral chair too. His name is Jim Butterworth. And I always had so much respect for Jim. And I remember when I was taking this class, it was called Critical Issues back in like 2003, 2004. And he would have us read 3 articles from Education Week, and then we would have to talk about it in class. So in 2011, when I got hired by Ed Week to start writing for them, it was really profound. Like all of those things I talked about, the insecurities, being an unsuccessful student, sometimes with the last name, like depending on what sibling they remembered that came before me, I wasn't always treated well. People had a deficit mindset sometimes with a guy like me when I was a student. So getting hired by Ed Week was a really profound experience. And so I would say that was the one that took off. And then what happened was that's when I also learned about feedback. Blogs are instantaneous, and you write something on a Thursday afternoon and you post it on a Sunday, and you start hearing from people pretty instantly. And some people just don't like what you're writing about. I mean, I got hate mail because I was writing a lot about social emotional learning, but I would specifically talk about LGBT issues. I still do, but back then it was a little bit more because that's what my first book was, and that was my doctoral. But I was getting hate mail from organizations. And I remember driving with my partner, Doug. I'll never forget, we were on a highway heading up north, and I was sort of whining about the feedback I was getting because I just couldn't believe that people wouldn't love everything that I was saying. And he looked at me and said, I think you have 2 choices. You can either give up the blog, or you're going to have to grow a thicker skin and realize that some of the things you're going to talk about are going to be things people don't want to hear. And that was like the connection it was more than just, it was getting hired was profound to write for Ed Week, but having him say that and realize that I had this pretty amazing opportunity to maybe talk about topics that I didn't deem controversial, but other people did. That's when I started to see a change within myself too.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. How far do you push things? You could talk about politics right now and probably offend some people, but also you feel like this has to be said, and or issues related to race or civil rights. And there's things that simply have to be said, but what's the best way to say it? But I would say if nobody is angry by what you're doing, you're probably not pushing hard enough. So the
Yeah,
fact
I've
that you
learned
get,
that.
the fact that you get some toxic responses probably means you're saying some good things, powerful things. You know, you're making a difference if you're ruffling feathers.
Yeah, I think I've become better at maybe doing it. Like a month ago, I remember writing a blog called "But I Don't Protest, So What Can I Do?" And it was just sort of, it's funny, and you know this from writing. There are times that it might take me like 5 hours to write a blog, and I'm thinking, oh, I don't think this is good enough to post. But there are other times that it comes down to half an hour, and I'm like, oh, okay, that was like all my emotion that just came out. It just feels like, you know, it has to come out. And, you know, when I post blogs like that, I'm always sort of reading the comments with one eye open because I'm thinking, what kind of pushback am I going to get? But I think I don't want to say I care less because I don't think that's the right way of saying it. But I know that the topic I'm talking about is much more important than some of the nasty comments I'm going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, the nasty comments have created a space where I actually want to speak out more because
Mm-hmm.
I can tell that this is something that we need to be able to talk about. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, and you've helped me with that quite a bit. I mean, we've known each other for a long time now, but the way in which you talk about things is always very eloquent. And even with the partnership principles, it's kind of like, just because somebody doesn't agree with me doesn't mean I want to vilify them and
Right.
be the one to be right. Like, I want to understand, and then also understand that it's not just about hearing my opinion out of their mouth. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we need to come to this understanding. And I think for working with you and and looking at the partnership principles, I think that's why they connected with me so much,
Mm-hmm.
because it was less about vilifying, it was more about understanding, and then just keep pushing the conversation.
Yeah, I think you have to speak this is my take on it. You have to speak the truth. But the moment you turn, for lack of better terms, an opponent, someone who's attacking your view, the moment you turn that person into a stereotype, you are doing the very thing you're criticizing. Because usually what you're talking about is dehumanizing someone. And when you turn somebody into a stereotype, oh, they're just whatever the name is,
Yeah.
then you're doing the very thing you're trying to get people to not do, which is to recognize the dignity of every human being. Very easy to recognize the dignity of people who are, you know, oh, best thing I ever read. I love it. You know, thank you. I honor your dignity. But when they attack you, to see them as a human being who has inherent worth, even though their actions might upset them. That's not to say you're cowardly about speaking the truth, but I think we have to fight the temptation to turn others into stereotypes. That's a dehumanizing act, I think.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because that's where the blog has been very handy for me. And I think people probably thought it was very strange early on because I remember distinctly, I had written something about, I must have talked about gifted education. And I must have made some comment that really made somebody very upset. And it was a guy from Michigan, and he blasted me in the comment. Well, at that time, I used to get an email notification that the comments were coming through.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw this and I was like, wow, he's really not happy with me. And so I got his email address and I reached out to him and I said, I feel like you have some very strong feelings where this is concerned. And I wasn't looking at it the way that you said it. I wondered if you would like to write a guest blog. And he got back to me and said, are you being serious? And I said, yeah, you have such a different perspective than what I was thinking, that if I'm going to call the blog Finding Common Ground, then I need to have people on there that I don't agree with or that I want to hear their perspective. He ended up writing 3 or 4 blogs about gifted education that did extremely well. And those were the moments that I looked and said, there's something powerful here, that there are so many people that can say things so much better than I can. So what I need to do is tap into that. It's so easy to overlook the comment and say they're a hater, so I'm just going to ignore that one because they don't love me. But in reality, what I decided to do was I would just start to reach out to those people and say, can you, are you interested in writing a guest blog? Now, there were people that did not respond to me because I think they thought I was insane. And they're like, there's just no way this guy is like, this is spam email from Peter DeWitt. But there were a lot of people that took me up on it. And it's funny because what I noticed is that some of the people that were vocal against a blog that I wrote suddenly became people that we could share ideas with, because it was looking past just one blog. And I think it's an important life lesson too.
No, that's a good point. That's really, I was thinking maybe the two of you could do one together, because that's the kind of thinking we need right now.
Yeah.
So I gave you this question in advance. So I don't feel like I'm springing it on you, but the question is, if you could sum up everything you're about, your work, in one sentence, like an elevator sentence, what would your sentence be? How would you sum it all up?
I've thought about so many things, but I haven't necessarily, I think I've changed it every time. I think my work is really about getting a deeper understanding of the people that I work with and trying to elevate where they are. And in the same token, though, I actually become elevated because I think you always talk about reciprocal learning. That was very powerful for me when I remember when I was first doing your work and talking about reciprocal learning. That's something that I think I want my work to be about. I don't want to just go in and tell you this is what you need to be able to do. I think my work is about understanding where you are and trying to elevate you and me at the same time. I often tell people that as a school principal, I would walk into a meeting with one idea, but I always walked out with a better one because of the power of my staff. If I walked into a meeting with one idea and walked out with the same one, then I wasn't a very good leader. So I think I approach my professional life and personal life that way.
I like it.
Does that help? Or that was a long elevator. That was like an Empire State,
No,
right?
It's maybe 10 floors. I think it's all good. No, I like your response, and I'm going to stick with that question now. I like that question. So I want to go through some of your books because we won't be able to talk. We've got so many, we can't talk about all of them in a lot of detail. So
you have a lot too.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if I know when I write, the act of writing the book teaches me something. I learn something. So I thought I'd go through the books and you could tell me what you learned. So the first one on my list is Coach It Further. So what did you learn writing that book?
So that was a very different book for me because I never planned on writing a book about coaching, and it was specifically about leadership coaching because I was doing and still do a lot of leadership coaching. But I wrote that as a narrative. It was a story between characters, and that was probably the most difficult book that I've ever written. Overall, like bookseller wise, it didn't do well. I mean, it didn't do as well as other books, but I think from a learning standpoint, I learned a lot about writing a narrative book and putting in important elements. Like the feedback has always been very positive about that book because people are reading it as a book club. And I've talked about some tough things, like how do you build collective efficacy in a school when you're a new principal, when maybe the two assistant principals were the ones applying for your job and didn't get it, and they feel like they were ripped off. Like, how do you build a leadership team when you've got two people who wanted your job? So I actually explored those topics. So I think what I learned is just how to tell a story with characters, and feedback wise, I'm getting a sense that worked really well. So,
well, I love Patrick Lencioni's books for that reason.
Yeah, and he was a big, and I may have said it in Coach It Further, he was a big influence in what I did, because when I read 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, I was like, wow, this would be a really cool way to write a book. And I started to do that in School Climate because I started off with small vignettes about characters, but it was actually a reviewer that said it would be kind of cool if DeWitt took that whole storyline thing and actually created a book about it. And I was like, might be a cool challenge. So yeah, that's what I did with that one.
Next on my list is School Climate. What did you learn writing that book?
School Climate has been my passion for a very long time. That was the first book that was less Hattie dependent. John and I have often talked about that. So School Climate was the first book that was less Hattie dependent, and it really focused on all those pieces that I wanted to that I did focus on as a school principal, which was enabling conditions. How do we set up a place? And it's hard in a school. I was an elementary school principal. I was a wonderful school. Like I went from high poverty city where it's like a block and stuff to 27 acres of land where there's a pond and our kids snowshoe during the winter. But during that time is when we also had to we had to be in perpetual lockout all the time. And I just kept thinking about what is it like to try to be a parent, to walk into an elementary school, which is probably for me the most symbolic. Like I think I always wanted elementary school because it reminded me of a time before my dad passed. So to me, elementary school like is symbolic of childhood and all that stuff. And now you're walking into this building where you've got to be buzzed in, show your license. How do you take all of that into account and still set up a place where kids can learn and feel valued and everything else? And then with the LGBTQ perspective, and then the diversity perspective, it's how do you do it in a way where marginalized populations actually feel and are a valued part of the community? And I said stuff about enabling conditions, like, what are the images in books? Are they positive representations? We knew when I was growing up, Native Americans and indigenous populations were represented in history books, but it was not a positive representation. So for me, it was about how do you set up enabling conditions where you've got that? And it's not just about checking it off the list. We have the images, so we're good. No, it's about now how do you take that and go to a deeper conversation? And that's where things like, I've always been a big fan of rethinking schools. This was sort of my Bible when I was a new teacher. And so it was about taking those kind of elements to say, how do we have those difficult conversations at an age appropriate level where everybody, marginalized populations, everybody feel like they're are a part of our community. So that's what School Climate was about.
I'm with you on the elementary school. I think I love the concept of a garden for children, a kindergarten, that for all I know, I could be totally mistranslating it, but I've always thought of this place of growth and kids. Flipping leadership.
So that was like the idea. It's funny how an idea can just set you apart. I had been flipping faculty meetings for staff because it came out of a deep conversation during a time of great accountability in New York State. So in my blog, I was very outspoken against the testing regime in New York State. And I was actually one of 8 principals that wrote a letter against the state education department stating that teacher evaluation should never be tied to high stakes testing. So during that time, there's a lot of accountability and mandates. We were dealing with budget cuts, and I was dealing with the school consolidation where we closed one classroom school and I absorbed a population. And my staff was saying that they didn't feel like they had a voice in their own learning from like the regional perspective, because they felt like every time they went to a training, it was about a new accountability measure. And so that's where flipping leadership came from, because I said, we do have control. Like we can take these mind-numbingly boring faculty meetings where I'm reading through an agenda that you got the day before, and we can turn them into a learning experience, and we can learn together. Like I want to learn with you, because I was a principal I was in classrooms every day. I did my morning rounds. I went into every classroom every morning. Then I would circle back and go in. So let's learn together and talk. And it was one of the reasons why they wanted me as a principal, because I was coming directly from teaching. Flipping Leadership was, that book was a short form book in a book series that I created with my now editor, Ariel Curry. Ariel was an associate editor at the time. And it was supposed to be 8 short form books around connected education. And we found all the authors through Twitter and social media and all this stuff. And it turned out to be 21 books. So Flipping Leadership, yes, is a book that I wrote, and it's a short form one, and it's about how principals can turn their meetings into a learning experience. But it also symbolized the fact that it was my first sort of dive into book editing, where I created a book series and it became 21 books. Where a lot of authors who have written several books ever since, that was the first book they had written. So yeah, so it symbolizes a few things for me.
That's when I met you, is when that book was just coming out, I think.
Yes, and that is I know we talked about this yesterday, but that's when you freaked me out because I was
I did not, just for the record, I hadn't, you said I could tell you were nervous, and I didn't notice at all.
I
So
had
you
like
didn't look
8
nervous to me.
people in the room, and and then Jim Knight and Jenny Knight walk in, and I'm like, oh my God, what am I
Well,
doing?
Jenny might make me nervous, but but I don't know about me. No, I didn't sense that you were nervous at all.
Yeah. So no, it was so that book started to become a turning point. I mean, I'm proud of Dignity for All because it was a book on my doctoral work. And I didn't want it to be relevant in 2020, and sadly it still is. I know that sounds kind of strange, but when you're talking about a topic like that, you almost want it to not be relevant anymore because it means that we've changed for the good. But then when Flipping Leadership came out, that's when I started to see, when I would present at conferences, where I was starting to get like packed houses. So that was starting to become a turning point for me.
And then Dignity for All, what did you learn writing that?
A lot. I came out in 1996 to my sister because she said on a very cold, dark night in the winter when I was going through a very deeply difficult time personally, she said, "I know you have an issue that we need to talk about." And I said, "I can't say it." And she said, "I think you're gay." And I can't believe I can't believe, because talking to you is like a therapist, but I remember back then in 1996, I looked at my sister and I said, I said 2 things. Don't tell mom, which is really kind of funny now. And then I honestly said, I am not going to be like this outspoken advocate about being gay. And so here I am 15 years later doing my doctoral work in safeguarding LGBT students. And I'm literally, the first book I write in education is on that topic. And I remember just that. So to me, that was a growing experience. It was really putting myself out there. It really spoke to the fact that I was very fortunate to have a family that I do. I'm the youngest of 5. My partner and I have been together for 19 years. And I was also in a school community that it was rural, and yet they embraced me in such a deep way that I still talk to many parents and kids that were there back then. So that was like a culmination where I just couldn't believe I was actually writing a book about that, and I did. So that was pretty profound for me.
How did you go from being afraid to tell your mom to writing a book that I'm confident has said to many people, you should be safe here, and has reassured a lot? How did you go from I don't even want to tell my mom to now being a person who helps people feel safe?
I sound like a mama's boy, don't I? That's
terrible. Nah, I've seen the pictures of your mom. I would be the same way.
I know. She's awesome. She's so I think I was when the words come out of your mouth, it's scary. When you hide something for, at that time it had been 4 years when I really was figuring it out. It's very frightening to have the words come out of your mouth. And many people think you come out and all of a sudden it's like, rainbow flag and ruby slippers. The reality is we have to come out.
Don't be dissing on the ruby slippers.
Yeah, I know. Oh, that's right. You're in Kansas. So my terrible reference. But many of us have to come out all the time. I actually just wrote an article on this. It's going to come out in Educational Leadership. They asked me to write an article on it. And so, my mom was great. It was a couple of months before I told her, but she was fantastic. And then when I met Doug, my partner, my parents had been together for 27 years before my dad passed, and he had cancer for 3 years, and they had such amazing relationships. And one of my sisters is still married to my brother-in-law. They've been married since the mid 80s. And my brother Frank, my oldest brothers, he and my sister-in-law Pam have been married for 35, 36 years. So there was always this, the relationship piece was very intimidating for me because I never thought I would have that. So when I met Doug, we had that. We're pretty boring. But I think just having that support made me come to a realization that, I need to speak out more about this because I need kids who don't have my life experience to understand what it's like, that they need to know that there is good that can come out of this. They can have a good life. It doesn't have to be doom and gloom. And also at the time that I wrote the book and at the time I was doing my doctoral work, we were consolidating a school, and there was a hate blog that a parent from the other school had created. And she actually targeted me and a couple of other people because of the fact that we were gay. So I remember just thinking, wow, I'm doing my doctoral work and I'm getting discriminated against. And this is how I feel. Imagine what it's like to be a 14-year-old kid.
Right.
And I think that gave me the resolve to speak out even more. So I would say it was quite an evolution over the years. Even, I'll be honest with you, even talking about it right now is not easy. I'm doing it because you are somebody I feel very comfortable with, but not always easy to talk about.
No, but I'm grateful for you doing it.
Thanks.
I think it's just really important to have the courage to speak up, and I think I know it makes a big difference for a lot of people. So I'm grateful for you talking about it. So we better move on to the other books. I promised you we'd focus on your other books, and we've got like 20 minutes left, but I'm grateful for everything you shared. So collaborative leadership, which I think is a great concept. When I was writing instructional coaching, Rachel Libsey was my editor. That's before I worked with Dan Alpert. And I said to her, I want to create a book like Professional Learning Communities, like Rick DeForest's book, which kind of defines a field. And I was still kind of trying to figure out, what are we going to call this thing? And then I landed on instructional coaching, and I thought, oh, that's what it is. I had the words. Other people had used the term back in the 90s. There was an article, but nobody had really popularized it. And I never knew anybody who'd written about it. So in my mind, we'd invented it. I always feel like Al Gore on the internet. But the thing is, finding a way to name something and then people can use it is powerful. And I felt that way about collaborative leadership. Once I saw the title, I thought, oh, that's a great title. So we don't have a ton of time because I want to spend some time on the other book too, but maybe help me understand, what do you mean by leadership? How would you define leadership? And then how does collaborative leadership change the meaning? So let's do leadership, and then how is collaborative leadership, what distinguishes it as a subtype of leadership, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. So from a leadership standpoint, I think the best example is actually servant leadership from Robert Greenleaf. I remember reading that book for either class or for some class, and it connected with me because it was what I wanted. It was about, how do I go in and serve you? Like, how do I help? I don't think I'm better than people. It's more like I want to, because to elevate you is elevating me, kind of thing. And I like that about servant leadership. So to me, leadership is about just what I had said earlier in the interview too, which is, how do I work with you and help us both get better at the same time? Because I'm always looking to improve. When I stop looking to improve, I think I've stopped growing. So to me, that's what leadership is about: working with others, and we become better and more impactful with students, because ultimately we know that that's what we want to do, is have an impact on students. When collaborative leadership was very purposeful, and it was up until the newest book, it was the quickest book I ever wrote. I'd been working with you, and I'd been working with John Hattie, and I was doing a lot of visible learning work, and people would come to me after and just say, so where do I start? And at the time, I had only been out of the principalship for maybe 1.5 years, I think. And so I still very much thought like a building principal. And I was looking, and at the time, John was ranking his influences. And I remember looking, saying, if I was a principal, where would I start? Like, what are the places? So that's when I really started to talk about instructional leadership, because if we're going to focus on learning, we have to practice some instructional leadership. Collective efficacy, feedback was something that was very profound, and it had a lot to do with both of you, because John had direct research on feedback, but feedback was something you were talking about too. And I was talking about through your work. And then there was assessment capable learners, which was very John language, and professional learning, because for me, it was about flipping leadership and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do this together? And then the last one was family engagement. And when I looked at those 6 influences, I sort of felt like, how do you do this together? And that's where the idea of collaborative leadership came from. Like, you have to be able to collaborate. I was not the first person to come up with the words collaborative leadership. There have been other research papers and books on it. But what I wanted to do, what I thought was interesting, is there was research by Kuhn, K-U-H-N, that said collaboration doesn't typically work any better than if you do it on your own. And the reason why is because we don't challenge each other's thinking. And I remember thinking, great, I'm calling this collaborative leadership. But it was really about, how do we come together, just like I did as a principal with the staff that I worked with and the families, and how do you get through, how do you do this work? Because you can't do it alone. And I had some profound experiences as a principal, because like, we built a playground together. And if you ever really want to, it's almost like raising a barn, right? It's when you're building a playground over several weekends as a school principal, and you see the sheer number of parents and kids showing up to help, you're kind of like, wow. And I remember his name was Pete Wren, actually said, he was a parent of mine. He said, many hands make light work. And I talked about that in the book. I wrote that as one of the beginnings. So to me, that's where collaborative leadership came from. It was very Hattie dependent, because I was purposeful in that. I wanted to, at that same time, I had been writing blogs around John's work, and I was known, or becoming known, for making John, who's very researchy at the time, become very practical. And so that book was all about taking John's work and making it very practical. So the influences are his, but all of the examples of what to do are things that I had done as a school principal. And that takes deep collaboration. You can't do it alone. And that was really, that book was very much the turning point for me in my career. And that's sadly, I mean, I guess it's, a mixed blessing, but that's when we weren't able to work together as much. I remember I was going to present at ASCD in March, and it was 6 months before the book came out. And I had done something for my publisher at the time, like a half an hour before, and I had to run to my room to, go in. And I was used to empty rooms to present in. So I was thinking, okay, 10 people are going to be in there. And I remember running to the room, and the woman at the door said, "We can't let you in." I'm like, "What do you mean you can't let me in?" I said, I'm the presenter. And she was like, "Oh." She said, "Because we need to close it down. The fire marshal is going to close it down." And I walked in, and it was just this huge room, and it was packed, and people were standing. And Jenny Donahue, who we both know, Jenny had texted me, and she was like, "Oh my God." And my editor, Artis Burbakovs, was sitting in the front row, and I said, "Wow, I think I'm onto something." So that book was very much a turning point for me.
I told you.
I know you did. You did. But I was like, Jim's being nice. And it still continues to do well. I still get lots of social media and all that stuff from that book. So,
well, instructional leadership, I don't know how you feel about it, but if I had written it, I would feel pretty proud. I think it's a real accomplishment. It's brings together a lot of really important things in accessible ways, like research and then implementation science and a lot of stuff brought together. So I want to, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but just tell me a bit about the book first, and then I'll ask just a couple focus questions.
Yeah, so that book, I learned a lot from running workshops. And what comes up in a workshop is a question. If it's one question, then it might be an isolated incident. But if it comes up over and over again, that's when you have to pay attention.
Right.
So a lot of my work is repeat work. So people were coming back saying, "I love collaborative leadership. How do you do this?" So I wrote School Climate. And then they were like, "I love that whole idea, but my principals don't know how to be instructional leaders." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So that's where instructional leadership came from. All my research, it is a book where I am very proud of it, because it's all me. And I was not expecting to write a book, but it is the quickest book that I ever wrote. And And I don't say that as a good thing. It's just that I loved it that much. Like I was just so involved with it.
Well, sometimes the clouds open up and the book gets written. Sometimes it just feels like I'm not actually writing this book. This book is being written through me. Now, I haven't had that experience with the book I'm writing right now. Right now, the book I'm writing is like, maybe I can get 3 words out, like carved in stone here. It's like, but sometimes it all opens up. Tell me about, there's so many things we could talk about, but well, tell me a bit about the research on, the way I wrote my question is, let's get to the exciting stuff right away. So tell me about the research on instructional leadership. How would you what's it tell us about instructional leadership?
So instructional leadership is actually one of the most researched forms of leadership over the past 50 years. And the interesting thing is about, no matter where we're talking, because this is where the work started to really open up internationally for me as well, is that a lot of international influence went into that. And what they found through the research is that when principals can focus on learning, that it's going to have a profound impact on student learning. That shouldn't be really a big surprise. But the problem is so many principals get bogged down in management. And instructional leadership is a very small aspect of what a leader does on a grander scale.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get it wrong, there's going to be a problem. Meaning you go in to do walkthroughs and you don't have credibility to be an instructional leader, then the feedback you're giving might actually irritate the person on the receiving end. And so for me, what I did is I looked at that 50 years worth of research, and then I started to, and I remember one in particular said it's like a black box. We know it has an impact, but we're not sure why. So what I did was I started to unpack it, because that's what I do. That's how I approach
Mm-hmm.
things. What does it really look like? And I didn't mean to have 6, because I was thinking, oh my gosh, I had collaborative leadership, 6 influences that matter most. I can have instructional leadership, 6 more influences. It wasn't like I couldn't do that, but I went into implementation, like a focus for learning, student engagement, instructional strategies, efficacy, but more of a school leadership efficacy. And I was looking at impact as well. And so it's really about looking at how do we have a common language and a common understanding. Mm-hmm. Many schools will go in and they talk about student engagement, but what does that really mean? They'll talk about the growth mindset. They'll talk about multiple intelligences, but what does that mean? They have a common language, but not a common understanding. So I wanted mm-hmm. to develop a way through implementation science. So we know people like Joelle and Killian have done program logic models. And John Hattie had introduced me to a lot of program logic models. So I created one, but I also did my own research. So I was surveying principals, and there was a discrepancy between principals who felt confident they were instructional leaders and teachers that didn't feel confident that their principals were instructional leaders. So it was about bringing together that dialogue too, about proximity. And one person in your school might think you're an instructional leader because you have those kind of conversations with them, but the person next door to them might teach with their door closed, and you walk past there and they fill out a survey and they're like, no, he's not an instructional leader. I don't even see him. So it was about what are those things that you can do to actually develop that common language and common understanding. And then I was always very conscious, you and I have been profoundly impacted by Michael Fullen. And Michael talked a lot about the implementation dip. So that whole idea of implementation science and program logic models was profound. You talk about the impact cycle when it comes to instructional coaching. So that idea of unpacking the cycle and what that looks like from a team aspect was very important. And then going into the specifics of when you're doing walkthroughs and learning walks, what do you look for? And do you actually have dialogue with the teachers about that? Or is it a one-sided conversation where mm-hmm. you are just choosing to do walkthroughs and the teachers are on the receiving end? And that happens way too often. So that's all a part of it too.
I've got to figure out words for this, but at the heart of what you're describing to me is depth and clarity. And yeah. So, I just had a coaching conversation this morning. Actually, I was coached by the coach, and I was talking to her about her coaching program. But they have a lot of statements that are powerful, like we want kids to develop persistence through growth mindset and through learning through failure, something like that. And they have a listing, and these are our principles of effective instruction. This is what good instruction looks like. So how do we coach around this? When you look at that phrase, who wouldn't want persistence? And the growth mindset basically says I'm a learner, I'm open to learning. But what does that really look like? How would you teach that? How would you measure it? You know, and to me, it's, and I'm not sure what the phrase is, maybe going the distance, but we get almost there and then we back off, maybe because it hurts our brains. But that going deeper is a really, that's why checklists and the learning instructional playbook is such an important part of what we do, because you need to figure out what the heck it is you're helping teachers do.
Right. Yeah.
So let me ask a couple questions that we got on Facebook, if that's okay. I think I just cut you. Did you want to say one more thing?
No. I'm ready for a question.
So one question was, we want to get time for two. We really don't even have time for two, but I'm going to ask them anyway. You know, especially right now, principals are being asked hard questions, and they have to give truthful answers, candid answers. And then what do you do if the answer you give isn't accepted by the questioner? That's one that came in.
Yeah, so it's not always going to be. I mean, I think that's a part of leadership, is that sometimes, I mean, I didn't always give the answer people wanted to hear. And we both needed to be okay with that, just as long as I was clear in where I was coming from. But I think there's two parts to that. I'm always a big fan of being proactive rather than reactive. So I think that also has to do with something you talk about quite a bit too, is the relationship piece. Like when I was hired as a principal, I was hired 4 months before I actually officially started, and I was still teaching. But one night a week, I was going over to the school to get to know the kids in the after school program or the teachers. And my secretary, who was going to become my secretary, gave me a yearbook, and I studied the names of the kids, and I studied the teachers, and she even wrote their spouses' names in. So by the time I started on July 1st, I knew everybody already. And I was lucky because the person I was taking over for was becoming the assistant superintendent. So it was all like, it was good. That paid dividends for me for years after. So the point there is that these are not isolated incidents. These questions are all part of the greater relationship that you're dealing with. And what you have to be okay with is that challenging each other's thinking. And I think that the one thing that I always tried to do, and I hope that I did it, was that if I was going to disagree with somebody or give somebody an answer that they didn't want to hear or they didn't like, I'm hoping that I did it with dignity in a way that I wasn't demeaning them. It just couldn't happen the way that it couldn't happen the way that they wanted it. But I always circled back. Just like with kids, adults can get escalated. So if somebody got escalated, and I can think of a couple of people in my mind, when people got escalated, I always gave them a few hours or 24 hours. And then I would go back in and say, can we talk? And when that happened with my staff, because it did, there were times that I would actually send out a whole school email. And one of my former teachers, Melissa, still talks to me about this, but I used to put together very thoughtful emails and say, I'm really sorry about how yesterday went. But these are the reasons why we need to be able to do what we're doing. Now I'm open within this to kind of expand, but so there are those kind of things that I think are really important. It's never just that isolated once. It actually speaks to the fact that relationships are incredibly important.
And never more important than now.
For sure.
Because people have got trauma and they're dealing with everybody else who's got trauma, and they're saying things they don't even know where they come from. And so if they feel they have you, if you're the principal, as someone with the capacity to give them some grace, I think that's really going to be primary. Yeah. Which gets to the second question, which is, what does an instructional leadership look like now in the time of COVID-19?
So I've been writing a lot about that for the blog, actually, because I took the instructional leadership book that just came out in February, and I've done a lot of research in some probably unconventional ways through social media and then surveys. And it's really about focusing on, I have surveys from several hundred students that show what they liked about pandemic teaching and learning and what they didn't like. So it's about paying attention to student voice that way. It's about, like the remote things, I'll run remote workshops now. So instead of a 6-hour workshop, I do 3 2-hours. And it's about making sure that your meetings, like I still flip faculty meetings, only I flip my workshops where they'll read an article and then we come together the next day and we have to talk about it in a reciprocal teaching kind of format. It's also about doing virtual walkthroughs. And people get very nervous about that because I think they look at, if you don't have your walkthroughs straight, then it could be a nightmare. But it's really about, if you've developed language around what is a walkthrough for, then we need to be able to do virtual walkthroughs and those kind of things to talk about what does really good remote learning look like? What does good hybrid learning look like? And even there are times when I'm running workshops that I use 5-minute lessons that people have done online. And then we talk about, so, let's treat this like a virtual walkthrough. So all of those things that you could do as an instructional leader in the classrooms, going into classrooms, then now you go into Zoom classrooms. You still can teach some lessons. I used to read to my students every Friday. So you can still create those kind of spaces where you're focusing on learning. I used to read to kindergarten through 5th grade. It was not necessarily in that order, but I read to them on Fridays. And I think that you can still do those kind of things just from a remote standpoint. So I think instructional leadership looks very much like that. You talk about current reality. You find your current reality, where are we right now? And then you start to say, where are the pieces of instructional leadership that are going to fit in that? One is using that program logic model to actually talk through what does good hybrid or remote learning look like. So and people can find those in like a lot of my latest blogs from March through August.
And the blog, how do people find the blog again, Peter? For the 2 or 3 people who don't read it.
You're very kind. Finding Common Ground. It's published by Education Week.
Right.
So I post once a week now.
And then our conversation would be on Education Week too. They could probably find it there.
Yeah, Seat at the Table. It's a new show I'm moderating, and you were kind enough to be my guest, which was awesome yesterday. So for that, they could just do a Google search for a Seat at the Table Education Week, and they can and they'll find it there. So the recorded versions are there. We've done lots of shows. We're up to number 5. So lots. I
think we should figure out how to put them back to back, because it's really been fun to be on both ends of the conversation. And I just want to say, to kind of wrap up here, that I've loved the chance to reconnect. It's been a while since we've talked. It's really been a pleasure just to check in, and I'm just grateful for the time. I thought it was really fun to have both conversations. So thank you so much.
This is so Jim, though, right? Like when I reached out to you to moderate, you were like, "I have an idea," and I thank you. I like that, Jim. It is. It's been really nice to reconnect.
Yeah, absolutely great. But we're not done yet. There's more to
come.
We're not. All right. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody who's been listening, and more to come. Thank you.